Greetings and happy Friday the 13th. I'm your host, Dr. Wolfula, with a different kind of video in recognition of Jason's special day. I'll be reviewing Topps Comics' Jason vs. Leatherface from 1995, the first ever original comic book starring Jason Voorhees, and simultaneously, it's the first ever original comic to star Leatherface, and in yet another first, the first time two of the big slasher icons of the 70s and 80s ever crossed over, nearly a decade before Freddy vs. Jason paid off its teased crossover at the end of Jason Goes to Hell the final Friday. Speaking of which, first let's go into Jason's and Leatherface's not-so-original comic book adventures before they crossed over. But first I want to give a shout-out to my sponsor, me! Pledge to my Patreon today to support the channel, help it continue to grow, and you'll also get access to weekly movie nights every Sunday, and archive commentaries if you miss the movie nights live. Just $5 a month to get a movie night every week. Pledge to patreon.com/Dr. Wolfula if you're interested in my bonus movie night streams, and I thank you in advance. Before Jason got his go in comics, Leatherface's first appearance in the realm of comic literature was in the fittingly titled miniseries Leatherface, published by the short-lived indie comics company North Star Publishing from 1991 to 1992. Written by Mort Castle, drawn by Kirk Jarvinen for issue 1, followed by Guy Burwell for the remainder of the series. Leatherface the comic, though, is just an adaptation of Leatherface the Texas Chainsaw Massacre 3, but it's very strange for a movie to comic tie-in. Usually, comic book tie-ins come out right before the movie they're based on to, well, promote the movie. But this comic adaptation of the third Leatherface movie came out a year after the movie was released, when the movie was out on video, no less. Kinda counterintuitive, right? What sets Leatherface the comic apart from other movie tie-ins is that, since it's a comic, it could go a lot farther than what was seen in the movie it's based on, which in this case had to be heavily censored to receive an R rating. Leatherface the comic is much more graphic and much more profane than the movie, which it treats more as a jumping-off point.
You shut the fuck up, motherfucker, this is my plate! I'll do whatever I want here in my plate!
The tie-in comic follows the basic plot of David Shaw's original script for Texas Chainsaw Massacre 3 very closely, but dialogue and characterizations are completely different, which might not be such a good thing. The first issue of Leatherface is a very faithful adaptation of the opening scenes of the third film, and, as drawn by Kirk Jarvinen, it's the nicest looking issue to me. From issue 2 onward, things get a little more off the rails, especially with Guy Burwell taking over on art. Burwell's art is spookier, but he draws everybody gaunt and like they're wearing lipstick, and Burwell's rendition of Ken Foree looks like Michael Berryman if he was a black guy. Got a total egghead.
Take it easy, take it easy!
Speaking of which, as soon as Ken Foree's Benny character arrives, the comic goes out of its way to remind you multiple times per page that Benny is black, either referencing his skin color or having members of Leatherface's clan call him different slurs. It makes the racism of Leatherface's family in the movie seem subtle in comparison.
You lost a dog, didn't you?
The comic also offers a look into Leatherface's perspective through his internal monologue, which is in the third person, and it makes Leatherface sound like a redneck version of Gollum. The comic also has some changes to Leatherface's family. Tinker Sawyer is changed into a chop-top-like hippie who looks like Egon from Real Ghostbusters, Tex looks like Bruce Campbell instead of Viggo Mortensen, and Grandpa's changed from an emaciated husk to an articulate, sophisticated old man who has no relation to the Sawyer family.
If they don't leave, we can't feed Grandpa.
The comic also features a grimmer ending closer to the film's original ending, where Benny dies instead of inexplicably surviving because he tested well with audiences. But not only does Benny get decapitated, Michelle, the survivor girl, uses Benny's severed head to bash Leatherface's skull in. Savage as fuck! The comic also ends without the climactic final battle with Alfredo. Instead, Michelle is just implied to die out in the desert from toxic exposure to the family's corpse pit.
There's roadkill all over Texas.
Got that right.
The Leatherface comic is an interesting read for fans of the Texas Chainsaw Massacre franchise, especially to see what could have been, delivering a darker, bloodier experience than the movie it's based on. But the art and text is a mixed bag. Like a lot of indie comics of its era, Leatherface tries a little too hard to be edgy when the material is already really edgy. It kinda comes off like Rob Zombie wrote the comic. North Star found some success with the Leatherface comic and planned to continue it, along with making a comic adaptation of the original Texas Chainsaw Massacre, and a few one-shot comics along with it, one of which would have explored Leatherface's origin story over 10 years before an actual prequel movie finally emerged. But for whatever reason, North Star canceled all of their Texas Chainsaw comics after Leatherface's 4th issue, and their announced comics ultimately went unreleased, possibly due to rights issues, as then Leatherface owner New Line Cinema switched publishers for the adaptation of their next big horror movie. The also short-lived Topps Comics, an obvious subsidiary of Topps the Trading Card Company, were given the rights to publish comics starring Jason Voorhees to promote the totally last film in the series, Jason Goes to Hell: The Final Friday. But Jason's first ever comic appearance was as a guest star in the 4th issue of Topps' comic Satan 6 in 1993, which was part of a Jack Kirby verse, essentially Topps licensing the rights to various unused ideas of comic legend Jack Kirby, with very little involvement from Kirby a year before his death. Jason's appearance in Satan 6 is actually referred to in the comic as a blatant plug for the latest Friday the 13th movie, and they ain't lying. The villain of the comic just summons Jason to fight the heroes for a few pages, but Jason can't be controlled, so he's sent back to hell, which spoils the ending of a movie titled Jason Goes to Hell. As Jason's first comic appearance, Satan 6 number 4 is not great, but his next full-blown comic appearance isn't much better. Topps published a tie-in comic adaptation of Jason Goes to Hell: The Final Friday in 1993 as a 3-issue miniseries. Jason Goes to Hell is my personal least favorite entry in the series, so it's safe to say I think that the comic adaptation of it also sucks.
In a Voorhees was he born. Through a Voorhees may he be reborn.
Unlike Leatherface, the Jason Goes to Hell comic came out months before the movie, so you get a little preview of how shitty the movie would turn out to be, saving you some money going to the theater because the comic is a faithful adaptation of that film.
You ready to pay?
Oh, jeez!
Scenes and dialogue are almost exactly the same from the movie to the comic. Some scenes added late in reshoots, like the trio of young adults camping, are absent from the comic. But otherwise, the Jason Goes to Hell comic plays out exactly the same as the movie, but at a faster pace, so I could imagine the comic would be confusing to read if you haven't seen the movie already. The comic is nowhere near as gory as the movie, which wasn't very gory to begin with, and some scenes are toned down. The homoerotic shaving of Joshua by Jason is absent, which is a good thing, I suppose. In some ways, the story of Jason Goes to Hell is better suited for a comic book. It can have more fun artistically rendering Jason's body-swapping, freaky Friday the 13th gimmick, making Jason feel more present. It feels more like a comic idea than a movie, honestly. The artwork of the Jason Goes to Hell comic isn't great, though. Cynthia Martin draws issues 1 and 3, the art of these issues is just fine, and the art of issue 2 is drawn by Bobby Rubio and is totally mediocre. There's ultimately nothing special about the Jason Goes to Hell comic adaptation. It's not a look into a version of the movie that could have been like Leatherface, it's just purely promoting a movie, a really shitty movie at that. And the artwork of the comic isn't very good. There's virtually no reason to read the Jason Goes to Hell comic. Now, the next comic to star both Jason and Leatherface, that's another story. Both the movie and comic of Jason Goes to Hell, of course, teased a crossover between Jason and Freddy Krueger, so Topps Comics was likely very interested in exploring this idea for a comic book while the movie version was tied up in development hell. Much in the same way Dark Horse Comics years earlier made Aliens vs. Predator comics more than a decade before that idea became a movie. New Line Cinema, the owner of both Freddy and Jason, was likely hesitant to allow their two icons to meet before their movie crossover.
Asshole! Up here!
So instead, New Line allowed Topps to make a comic featuring a crossover between Jason and Leatherface, the latter of which New Line Cinema also owned at the time. A crossover fittingly titled Jason vs. Leatherface, a 3-issue miniseries published in 1995, written by Nancy Collins and drawn by Jeff Butler. Jason vs. Leatherface is the first attempt at a crossover featuring modern American slasher movie icons. Previous attempts at the Universal variety featured monsters based on literature or folklore. But at the same time, Jason vs. Leatherface is a very strange approach to the crossover premise, and its title is more than a little misleading. The comic doesn't take place in the continuities of either the Texas Chainsaw Massacre or Friday the 13th films. Crystal Lake is in Vermont in the comic instead of New Jersey, and Jason's mom is named Doris and looks totally different from Betsy Palmer. At the same time, Leatherface's family is a little different from any version seen in the movies. These inconsistencies were pretty common with tie-in media at the time. Creators don't necessarily want to be restricted by continuity to tell a story, and there was usually nobody around to care about canon and worry about how things fit together. Nowadays, of course, you just throw away a bunch of sequels when you make a new entry in a series. Easy.
Just some things you gotta do. Don't mean you have to like it.
Jason vs. Leatherface is a horror crossover that begins with an environmental message. A faceless evil corporation straight out of Captain Planet called Linhart Amalgamated has been dumping toxic chemicals into Crystal Lake. The pollution has made the lake anything but crystal, and the lake can't be cleaned, which is a horrible reminder that the 21st century will be the last that the Earth will be able to sustain life. But it's not too much of a problem for Linhart Amalgamated. They're gonna move their pollution operations to Mexico and fill Crystal Lake in, replacing it with a corporate headquarters in a totally rural area. While scooping up Crystal Lake's muck to dump in Mexico, Jason also becomes an unwitting stowaway in a train's waste container. This is the worst that Jason Voorhees has likely ever smelled before. To make it ever clearer that this is Jason at his lowest point, during a stop in Texas, Jason kills a kindly hobo on the train, but even worse, Jason cuts the hobo's dog in half. This isn't the Jason I know. He's always been so kind to animals. Just remember Muffin. Remember Muffin. After derailing the train and forcing Mexico to wait a little longer for its toxic sludge delivery, Jason encounters a frightened Charles Bronson in the woods, pursued by Leatherface and the hitchhiker. Jason and Leatherface duel over their prey, but Jason out-finesses Leatherface, and ultimately Jason kills the Death Wish lookalike, and Jason uncharacteristically makes friends with the two brothers. I guess sensing some like-mindedness with the family, it really does come off as fan fiction you'd read on DeviantArt or something. Further uncharacteristically, the hitchhiker is the one that taunts and teases Leatherface. The cook instead stands up for the younger brother Bubba, while Leatherface cries like a baby upstairs beneath his Conan the Barbarian poster.
You damn fool! You ruined the door!
There are some other big differences with Leatherface's family in the comic from the films. The family is called the Slaughter family instead of Sawyer, which is series co-creator Kim Henkel's preferred on-the-nose name for the family. The family in the comic lives in a town called Sawyerville instead. The cook in the comic isn't named Drayton. He's W.E. Slaughter, a pun on the We Slaughter barbecue from the original film. There was a W.E. Slaughter in The Next Generation and a W.E. Sawyer mentioned in the third film's opening. I think the cook's intended name by Kim Henkel was W.E. Slaughter.
You probably didn't know that, did you?
It's also revealed that Leatherface and the hitchhiker share a mother named Velma, no relation to Dinkley, who died before the events of the story. Velma was the cook's sister, which makes the cook the uncle of Leatherface and the hitchhiker, but the cook is still their half-brother because it's also implied that Velma was impregnated by her own dad, leading to the birth of Leatherface and the hitchhiker. They do things a little differently down in Texas, and by do things differently, I mean fuck their dads.
Just some things you gotta do. Don't mean you have to like it.
Jason vs. Leatherface for its last 2 issues is surprisingly mostly a spooky slice-of-life story, with Jason just living with the Slaughter family, taking in their day-to-day life. The abuse that Leatherface suffers at the hands of the hitchhiker reminds Jason of the abuse he endured from his own father, who had a Chairman Mao haircut. And we also learn that eventually Jason's mom, Doris Voorhees, eventually kills Jason's dad. Man, Doris Voorhees was thick as fuck. I would.
Just some things you gotta do.
The comic goes to great lengths to make Jason and Leatherface really sympathetic. It's revealed that Jason only kills those that love because it was something that he was deprived of. It's not so much of a horror story. We're made out to identify with killers and cannibals like they're a murderous, incestuous Addams family. Jason and the family do kill at one point in the story. They target a couple with car trouble, but the hitchhiker disapproves of the way Jason kills, killing too quickly, not taking pleasure in torturing the victims first. Ultimately, the conflict that leads to Jason versus Leatherface kinda living up to its name is that Jason begins to stand up against the hitchhiker on Leatherface's behalf. And after the hitchhiker gets mad at Leatherface for touching the hitchhiker's comic collection, Jason tries to murder the hitchhiker, and after the cook tries to come to the hitchhiker's defense, the cook becomes a target of Jason as well, and ultimately the Saw is family, so Leatherface comes to blows with Jason, even though Jason was just trying to help Leatherface out of his toxic family.
The Saw is family.
The fight between Leatherface and Jason only goes for a couple pages. It's ultimately cut short by the hitchhiker bashing Jason's brains in, which is pretty anticlimactic. If this was a movie and the final fight played out like this, I'd be pretty pissed off, but it's a comic, so it has some more leeway to be disappointing. In the end, the Slaughter family decides they can't eat Jason. He was like them. He was just mixed up. So they give Jason a mafia-style funeral in a nearby lake, with Leatherface actually dropping a rose into the lake. What is this, Batman visiting Crime Alley? But Jason re-emerges from the lake and ultimately decides not to take revenge against the Slaughters and just goes back home to Crystal Lake 2,000 miles away. Jason's gonna get his steps in. Talking a bit about the comics art, I should mention that British comic artist Simon Bisley did the covers for all 3 issues of Jason vs. Leatherface. Bisley is one of my favorite comic book artists. Often drawing on Lobo and heavy metal, his style is like a grittier version of Frank Frazetta. Bisley's characters are muscled up, exaggerated, intense, and edgy, very much of the 90s, but his painterly technique separates Bisley from his contemporaries. The covers for Jason vs. Leatherface are a total reimagining of the characters that look cool, but you can't judge a book by its cover, and like with most comics, the covers aren't the best representation of what the actual art looks like. The actual interior art by Jeff Butler is no Simon Bisley, but it's pretty okay. It's very reminiscent of EC Comics artwork where everything is dark and ugly in a good way, but the issue I mostly have with the art of Jason vs. Leatherface is most of the characters look like frogs with arched, devious eyebrows. The designs of the comics icons are also just not really appealing. Jason's design in this is based on Jason Goes to Hell, Jason's worst look to me. You can't make the head fused with the mask look work in either live action or art. It just makes it look like Jason is wearing a tiny mask over his big ass head, and his burned head makes Jason look like an alien made out of bubblegum. Simultaneously, Leatherface looks like a blaxploitation version of Frankenberry. The cook looks like the Joker without makeup, and worst of all, the hitchhiker looks nothing like Edwin Neal. He's chinless with an emo Linus haircut on top of a Squidward-shaped head, and with a swastika cut into his cheek. Good luck hitchhiking with that on your face, jackass. The hitchhiker also has a lightning bolt on his forehead because he's the boy who lived, I guess. The design of the hitchhiker really feels like a foretelling of the Jared Leto Joker, adding unnecessary flourishes on a character's face to make them look edgier. Also, the hitchhiker's name in the comic is just Hitchhiker. He introduces himself to people as Hitchhiker. I'm guessing it's his legal name in this continuity.
It's really good. You like it?
Jason vs. Leatherface was maybe intended to be a jumping off point for more comics starring these versions of Jason and Leatherface from Topps. It seemed like they left the door open for Jason to return to Crystal Lake and find it was replaced by a corporate headquarters, but this was never paid off. No further Jason or Leatherface comics emerged from Topps Comics. Topps ceased comic publishing 3 years after Jason vs. Leatherface was published, and Avatar Press took over the rights to publish comics based on Leatherface and Jason, mostly making comics based on the Texas Chainsaw Massacre remake and Jason X. Jason vs. Leatherface is an interesting story for its historical value as the first slasher crossover and the first original Jason and Leatherface comics, and it's interesting to explore how these two mentally and physically deformed horror icons would interact with each other. But there's not a lot of kills in the story, and Jason and Leatherface don't really fight much. It can be a little too cutesy for its own good, too. Still, Jason vs. Leatherface is worth a read for fans of both horror franchises who enjoy the novelty of crossover stories. I give Jason vs. Leatherface Jason's mom out of Leatherface's mom.
Happy Friday the 13th.
Before I go, I want to promote my zombie servant Goulash's channel, The Gulag, which is back with some new videos covering the Beetlejuice franchise. Goulash and I just reviewed Beetlejuice, the long-awaited sequel. Link to that video is in the description or by clicking this card. Subscribe to the Gulag channel today. I command it. This video is made possible through the pledges of my Patreon supporters, and I'd like to give a very special thanks to the kind folks pledged to my shoutouts tier. All of the support on Patreon means a lot to me, and it helps my dark influence continue to grow. If you like this video, like it, and if you loved it, click the subscribe and bell buttons for more vids. Be sure to also keep in touch by following me on social media at Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter at Dr. Wolfula. While I still have your attention, consider pledging to my Patreon to support the channel and get bonus content like previews, VIP Discord server access, private movie night streams, and credits in videos. Consider pledging at patreon.com/Dr. Wolfula. Also, check out official Dr. Wolfula t-shirts and other merch on tpublic.com/user/Dr. Wolfula. Thanks for watching. See you all next time. Dr. Wolfula signing out.